Although I have lived in some of the world's great cities, Beijing, Cairo, and Hanoi, to name just a few, and I'd like to explore briefly, just some of the commonalities in cities around the world. I'd like to start by sharing the Rockefeller Foundation's goals, one of our goals in particular, building resilience, and how we see applying that to the notion of cities, both in the US and around the world. We define this goal as building the resilience of individuals, households, communities, cities, and institutions to survive, adapt, and even grow in the face of both acute crises and chronic stresses. We think this is important because managing for resilience includes focusing on slow variables, not just fast ones. And of course, improving adaptability is more than just adapting, so I'll come back to this in a moment. We developed this goal several years ago when we began focusing on climate change, believing that the goal of adapting to climate change was actually more appropriate, the goal of building resilience more appropriate than just adapting to climate change because of the scale of this problem for our planet. But we think about resilience far more broadly than just in relation to climate and environment issues. We need to build resilience to shocks and stresses that originate in social, economic, and political systems as well. To build our own competence in this area, we've drawn on a variety of disciplines, from engineering to psychology to economics and disaster response. As the Rockefeller Foundation approaches our centenary, we'll be celebrating our 100th year in 2013. We're reflecting on what really makes a difference for people living in poverty, our core mission since our founding to improve the well-being of humanity. In this century, it's obvious that assumptions we might have made earlier about a linear, secular improvement in the lives of people were wrong, whether those people live in rural or urban areas. Related to this, addressing the challenges of cities has been an interest of ours for more than 50 years. And innovation remains a hallmark of our work. As we define it, a new product, process, or service that's discontinuous from previous practice, one that yields new avenues for solving acute problems or for moving forward an organization's mission. How can we combine these concepts with the concept of building resilience? While cities have been the engines of growth, human development, and democracy for every country in the world, that doesn't mean that we've provided a decent quality of life for everyone living in them. The livability survey illustrates that. And the complexity of challenges facing cities only grows with the shifting demographics and the resource constraints that we've been talking about today. As some of you will know, in 2008, we convened an urban summit in our conference center in Bellagio, Italy, and I was very pleased to hear our Bellagio Center mentioned in the last panel. That spawned a whole host of important partnerships and projects, many of which we supported ourselves through a multi-year effort called Networks for Urban Innovation. Since most of the 2 billion people we will add to our global population by 2050 will live in urban and peri-urban areas, many of them in Asia, we're taking stock of our learnings from these recent years of effort. Let me mention just 5 of our top-line takeaways from our work in cities in the US and across the world. These relate specifically to resilience and sustainability. First, there's inadequate infrastructure investment almost across the board, with inchoate plans for revenue raising to build needed infrastructure, even though this is the source of livelihoods for people across the planet. And of course, this is a very topical issue in this country. Second, there are unsustainable rates of motorization. And again, something that the Rockefeller Foundation is working on is an initiative to promote equitable and sustainable transportation. That will improve the resilience of people who don't have to depend on a car for their day-to-day commute to work. There's a failure of public and private sector service provision. This is not only hindering the growth of cities, but especially equitable growth. There's a paucity of clear planning paradigms for cities in the global south, and arguably even in the US, if we think about the challenge of cities that we want to thrive despite being shrinking cities, we clearly haven't tackled that question of planning. And finally, there are growing divides in wealth and provision of services, which in many cases creates an invisible underclass. When I asked the Municipal Arts Society what they wanted us to reflect upon at this summit, they noted that they link livability and resilience in their work. They believe that creating diverse networks and systems of exchange, creating self-organizing activities that foster resilience, are becoming the great urban challenge of our time. I couldn't agree more. They asked to us, what does resilience look like and how can we help foster it? A new study on disaster resilience and a literature review on resilience that we released recently provide useful insights as to what metrics are useful. First, most of the indicator sets define resilience as a multifaceted concept and an attempt to measure resilience across multiple dimensions: physical, social, economic, institutional, and ecological. Also, most of the indicator work is being done with a local community-level focus. Within the physical dimension, indicators typically cover structures in the built environment, utilities and lifelines, and hazard defenses such as levees or land use controls in hazardous areas. The social dimension includes demographics, societal, and social network indicators. The economic dimension includes employment, wealth, and revenue. The institutional dimension covers government and non-governmental organizations. And the ecological dimension, of course, relates to the natural environment and natural systems that enhance resilience. On a more practical level, we draw from the work of our outstanding grantees in urban innovation and the work that we're supporting in depth in Asia in an initiative called ACERN, the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network. That incorporates approaches that we believe can scale up eventually to hundreds of cities around the world. Right now it's in 10 cities in 4 countries. We've identified through that both opportunities and ingredients for success. Amongst our learnings, opportunities are built most often on bringing together government, poor and disadvantaged communities, and the private sector to catalyze and scale more efficient, demand-driven service provision to poor populations. Moreover, inclusive planning, as I'm sure we all know, brings more lasting solutions. Urban planners must work directly with community-based networks, civil society actors, and private actors to generate lasting solutions. To this end, in countries as diverse as India and South Africa, we've worked with institutions like the Indian Institute for Human Settlements and the African Center for Cities to incubate new paradigms for urban planning. The Indian Institute for Human Settlements, for example, is a first-of-its-kind practice and innovation-oriented knowledge institution seeking to bridge the conventional divide that exists between excellence, scale, and inclusion. These institutions, in turn, are linking with Columbia University and other centers of academia in the U.S. to create a truly global network of innovators devoted to improving the resiliency and sustainability of cities. We've supported the African Association of Planning Schools, a network that's grown to almost 50 institutions on the African continent, in creating a revised urban planning curriculum and case studies that focus on so-called wicked problems in cities, such as how to improve the lives of workers in informal economies and protect entitlements to housing. I just want to spend a few minutes on climate change in particular. While resilience to climate change can't be generalized to all citywide threats, what creates an enabling environment for climate change resilience does show what is needed more broadly. We published a study last week, now available on the internet, called Catalyzing Urban Climate Resilience, and it synthesizes the learnings from our ACERN initiative in Asia. The ingredients that were crucial to building resilience include not only devoted financial resources and skilled personnel, but other factors for an enabling environment. Shared learning dialogues across sectors, scales, and communities of actors, not least linking the natural and social sciences and linking city and national governments. Another finding is that strategies have to address not only the physical dynamics of systems, but also the social and institutional context. Third, resilience planning cannot wait for perfect climate information. This just doesn't exist at the city level, at least not yet. Fourth, there is a need to bridge the language, scientific language, and local realities. Related to this, which we see here in the US and elsewhere, few people are aware of climate change impacts where they live. So engaging both policymakers and local populations requires finding issues that they view as tangible and immediate. Lay the foundations with storm risks, flooding, or water supply, and then address wider sources of risk afterwards. I know there are cities in the US that are already beginning to cope with issues like gradually but measurably increasing temperature in the summer months, and that's building resilience to that alone will be significant. Another ingredient, of course, is to tailor strategies to local contexts. Cultures, bureaucratic structures, physical characteristics differ, so cut and paste solutions won't work. And the skill needed to make all of this work is not principally technical. It's really about personal and professional characteristics of collaboration that break down the silos that exist between government departments and sectors. Earlier this year, I attended a convening of our grantees in this Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network in Indonesia. It was a fascinating experience to see people from all of these sectors from 4 countries speaking Hindi, Vietnamese, Bahasa Indonesia, and Thai, as well as English, in a room of about 100 people, generating a lot of really interesting comparisons and contrasts across the different contexts. Importantly, the resilience agenda needs more champions. Effective engagement within cities, as we've seen in our own work, depends on an active commitment to resilience planning from at least a small number of individuals who are well connected with diverse local groups. For most cities, climate change is a new and poorly understood issue, and effective responses have to include a broad base of support. So identifying a few charismatic and articulate individuals who can serve as champions can really facilitate the growth of awareness and action. Of course, we know New York has some of these individuals. The Rockefeller Foundation is proud to have incubated and supported this kind of leadership in New York in recent years. We supported New York City's panel on climate change and tools used by the city and its task force to identify climate change risks to the city, recommended protection levels, and coordination strategies for adaptation. We supported the Museum of Modern Art's Rising Currents exhibit, in which multidisciplinary design teams explored different sea level rise adaptation options for the city. And more recently, we're supporting the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance to reform policies and practices on waterfront areas designated as heavy industrial or polluting zones, which happen to be in high-risk areas. The city administration, working together with community groups, will increase these communities' resilience to climate change impacts from both sea level rise and storm surges. So let me end with 2 final thoughts on how this summit can generate new directions for working on both resilience and sustainability. First, the examples that I've given illustrate how shared learning can and must span regions. The discontinuous practice inherent in innovation, in order to meet the challenges of this century, should incorporate global dialogues. Creating more resilient and sustainable cities may be the best example of how learning and discovery will henceforth be global, not from the US to other countries, not from rich to poor countries, but through truly networked forums that engage actors across the public, private, and civil society sectors. And second, we must learn to take the lessons and best practices from individual cities and learn how to aggregate, synthesize, and build on the learnings, as we've tried to do in our Asian Cities Alliance. And using a close-to-home example, the tragedy of the 9/11 attacks in New York was very specific. But the resilience of New York in the aftermath of this tragedy offers potent lessons, not only to other places in the US, but to cities across the world. The Rockefeller Foundation looks forward to partnering with many of you to continue on the journey of discovery on resilience and sustainability in the years ahead. Thank you.